Hello.
Hey, so first thing I want to say is I'm sick, you can probably tell, and this is impromptu as fuck. So yeah, sorry about that. If I'm hard to hear, just let.
No, you're very easy to help.
So I used to be in Provi. Just want to preface this for a very long time, and right around when I joined, it wasn't long after it seems that you quit. I'm not sure when that was, uh, but your name was still in circulation, and people pretty much knew who you were, especially if they were like in the upper echelons or playing. Um, and you've clearly made an impact on Provi, and Provi still exists. It's actually, I think it might be the only null block that still exists in its current form, air quotes, that it did back in the day. And people will disagree of whether or not it exists in the same sense, in the sense that if they really follow NRDS, some people will agree with that, some people will not. Obviously, Provi people probably agree with that. Um, I don't think that they always do, but they try. At least some of them do. And of course, a lot of people come from Providence. Uh, Probably after you left, though. So keep in mind that that's probably a contributing factor to why people remember who you were. And so I just want to ask you some questions so I can get your sense of what Eve is, CVA is, Provi is, and was, and maybe will be. And also what you think of current Eve. So
That's fine. If you're going to record this, can I ask you that you send me a copy of the recording when you're done?
yeah, would you rather I send it to you before I post it?
I didn't realize you were going to post it public. I thought you just wanted to ask me some questions.
Well, I can or can't. It's up.
Well, I guess I don't mind. I say the same things in private I say in public, so
Yeah, it's a
so
good way
all
to follow.
comes out. I th- hmm.
I mean, it's up to you. Clearly, people know who you are, and obviously,
A
like when
surprising
you
number of people do. I have to say, I've discovered that. I thought everybody would have forgotten after 7 years away.
well, I know people who seem to be more happy with your leadership of CVA than Equinox.
Well, that's inevitable, isn't it? There's always going to be some people. And it's easy to look back on a golden past and, you know, forget the difficulties. I think, generally speaking, people are trying to hold up NRDS. Yes, there are failings, and there always were. Um, it's not a question of whether mistakes are made, it's a question of what you do about it when they are made. And uh, I'm certainly aware of a lot of good efforts by a lot of the Diplos and people who handle the cost lists and things. I know a couple of people at least who put a lot of work in.
Right on. So, first thing I want to ask is, what do you currently think of Eve, the way it is now with all the features that it has, and the dynamic of the meta, the Nublex in it? Any experiences you have? Now, I'm guessing you don't have like exposure to everything. I don't know, but just I'm curious on your take.
I don't have personal exposure to everything, certainly, but on the other hand, I talk to people. I like talking to people. Here I am talking to you for no particularly obvious reason. Um, and people tell me stuff. So, second and third hand, I probably know an awful lot. Um, Eve has done some things fantastically and some things terribly. It made some really fundamental mistakes, and the CSM is the biggest one.
Yeah, so when I talked to you a little bit, you said that you don't think that the CSM is a good idea. Now, before I go ahead, I want to make some acknowledgments. Some members of Providence Block have been in the CVA, and I personally have benefited from that. A good example is the fact that Pocos, I think it was Core Blood Brothers, he made it so that Pocos could be accessed by anyone. You didn't necessarily have to be part of the alliance. I could be wrong about that, but it's things like that that some people, even from Paravi, have done that have been good for the game. Do you think that CCP have, would have been capable of doing that themselves, or do you think that CSM does more harm than good, or what's your take on it?
I think it does a lot more harm than good. There's several problems. The first thing is, I think when you're doing something like this, you need to have your own vision, not borrow other people's. Listening to the players is very dangerous. But even if you are going to listen to the players, the CSM is not listening to the players. The CSM is listening to people who can get themselves large voting blocks behind them. Almost everybody who gets on the CSM is somebody important in a very large alliance. So what they're doing is speaking to the leadership of the largest alliances, not the player base.
Right on. I heard. I don't remember the specifics. I think it was the Matani or someone like that said that one of their CSM members would rip into another CSM member in some fashion. Now, I thought that was funny because, especially with the drifter thing, it seems like the alliance leaders are pissed off by people getting killed by drifters, especially citadels. But the line members of alliance, like the large alliance blocks, don't really care. Aside from maybe logisticians, um, or they love it. I've seen a lot of people from my personal block who love it, and my personal block also has a lot of people from Provi, by the way. Um, and so it seems like people from the CSM at the top of their group might actually be against things that most people would actually like. I don't know if you like it or not, but it's just what I've observed. People seem to generally like the fact that drifters are going around bashing everything. Um, where you're coming from, because it almost seems like there's a disconnect uh, in how people vote from what actually is best for the game, right? Like a lot of people will vote for wormholers, but they'll just do what makes the most sense for their corp. But also sometimes where that's not the case. Um, so I totally understand where you're coming from on that. So do you think that the CSM is like 95% just doing what their block tells them to, or do you think that like in some ways they kind of try to do what they can for the game overall, like more?
Well, there's two sets of problems here. Firstly, a lot of them will be trying to do things that benefits their block, or even not necessarily their block, but that type of organization. I mean, goons probably don't want things that benefit Pandemic Legion and vice versa, but probably the same things benefit both of them. But the other thing is, we all have our own prejudices, and it's very difficult to see your own prejudices. But since they're all the same type of people, they're all going to have the same type of prejudices.
That actually makes a lot of sense because one of the examples was some time ago, I believe it was a CSM change that less wormholes would appear in nullsec, and I think that was to protect nullsecers. My experience was is that once I'm in nullsec, I find it Uh, still not that difficult to find wormholes, but once I'm in wormhole space, it's rather difficult to get into nullsec, especially if you're in a larger ship, because there's small size wormholes now that are only suitable for frigates and destroyers. Um, and so, in that sense, sometimes the changes that have been proposed by the CSM, at least that I remember being proposed by the CSM, I could be wrong, uh, have had unpredictable consequences and benefits. But it does. I kind of agree with you. It does seem like that was proposed by their own block in their own interest. So yeah, I think you have a point on that one. But
Well,
sometimes it's also the case that it can be beneficial to Eve overall, even if it wasn't
sure,
intended.
sure. What I was trying to say was sometimes they will be proposing things that they think are in their own interest, and sometimes they will be proposing things that they think are in the benefit of Eve, but may not be because they can only see things from one point of view.
Yeah, and so
But I mean, sometimes it's been deep and nasty. What made me leave the game was a patch called Dominion, which was specifically targeted at destroying Providence. It was designed to do that. And I didn't even know at the time that this had been designed by the CSM. I just thought CCP hated us. And even when I found out it had been designed by the CSM, I assumed that CCP would have been able to figure out what was going on, and if they let it go through, well, you know, they must dislike us. I mean, they've done other anti-CVA things since, but this was made way the biggest. Um, I mean, it was just so ridiculously biased against Provi that it's laughable. Um, and I think quite possibly it was just stupidity by CCP. They couldn't see that this was what it was doing. And to add insult to injury, in the run up to the Dominion patch, they actually came out and said things like, "We're doing this to change the game in this sort of way because we want to see more operations like CBA." Yeah, right.
So, I wasn't around back then. I think I came around late Odyssey or early Rubicon. I did something around there. So I have significantly less experience with you in terms of that. I don't know the before and after. It seems like Pravi came back fine. Uh,
It
they
it recovered. It can't ever be the same. Uh, One of the things that Dominion did was it accelerated a natural process anyway, which is that power blocks get bigger and bigger, and it massively accelerated this. Which is part of the reason that, as a result of that patch, we attempted an invasion of a neighboring region of Catch, because it was obvious that the game was going to devolve into a few giant power blocks. And so we had to make a play to try and be one of those. And at the time, CVA was pretty powerful in Providence in general. Um, there's no possibility of it regaining things. But things always have unintended consequences. And although Dominion was a complete disaster for CVA, it did have one beneficial consequence for CVA, and that is that, of course, there'd never been anything like it, because the only reason CVA is able to maintain its existence now, apart from fantastic performances by a lot of people in CVA who struggle to keep it going, is that it always has existed. It's part of the EVE landscape. People know that if they take Provi of us, we'll get it back eventually. And there is a lot of goodwill amongst a lot of people towards Providence, because a hell of a lot of the player base started out in Provi and then moved on. And no other attempt to create such a region is ever going to have those advantages. And it could be completely impossible to start something like this from scratch now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So it that was really before my time. Uh, I don't know if you would remember, but I'm curious to know, based on your take, what were the to the best that you can recall, specific changes that hurt CVA more than helped them in Dominion?
They were so huge. I mean, it's the sort of thing, any one of them you might have thought, oh, that's bad, that's unfortunate. But there were lots of them. But I'll give you some examples. They changed the way defenses worked. Before, control of systems had depended on the number of POS you had in system. So to get rid of people from a system, you had to destroy their POS. You had to have the majority of the POS to control solve, and then that allowed you to attack the station if there was one. And so that meant, firstly, it would take a lot of effort because there were a lot of POS. And secondly, we had defenses that shot back. Dominion introduced system defense units and things that didn't shoot back. It was just a question of HP that you had to blast through. So all the effort we'd put into defenses, which was what we were aiming for, since it was never the purpose of CVA to take anything beyond Providence, um, all those defenses are worthless. It all suddenly became about fleet battles. But at the same time, they massively, and I mean, they've obviously realized that they overdid it and they've reined it back in since then, but they massively boosted the powers of supercarriers and titans. It was just insane. And before, I've always worked on the feeling that the way Eve was, when you went up in class from frigates to cruisers to battleships to capitals to super capitals, you got something that was twice as good but cost you 10 times as much money. So supercarriers and titans were good, but they were fantastically expensive. But Dominion actually made it so that they were better value than capitals. Um, and we hadn't bothered to build many, and suddenly we were up against people who built loads, and our defenses were worthless at the same time because it was all about those head-to-head fleet battles, and POS guns did nothing. And simultaneously, they made it much, much more expensive to maintain things like cyno dampers, which we had a lot of Provi cyno damped, and the jump bridges, which were very useful in our defense network to move fleets around Provi fast to intercept pirates. Um, because of, how can I explain this? Because of the do or die, all or nothing battle before, it had been lots of small battles. That made it down to a few big battles. If you couldn't face up to them toe to toe, then it really didn't matter what you had. There's no difference between having 3/4 of the enemy strength and 5% of the enemy strength. You win or lose, so that was that. There was no point turning up. And we have always relied and would have to rely on wearing enemies down. And that's what we've always done in the end. And another thing was, before Dominion, you could, if you had sovereignty throughout a constellation, you could make one system a constellation capital. And constellation capitals were immune to attack and all the POS in them. Now, of course, you could attack them. You just had to take some of the other systems first so that it stopped being a qualified constellation capital. But that meant you could build supercaps and things. And of course, as soon as Dominion came in, supercaps were vitally important. But Providence is easily in range of lots of places. And all those POS had lost their defense mechanism. And the only real defense mechanism was to build them far out in deep space. And one of the reasons the blocks got so big was that you not only wanted to control a lot of space, you wanted to have a lot of space around your space so you could see people coming and things. And probably wasn't big enough to pull that off. What else did it do? Oh, it also changed. This was just so stupid, I can't get over it. It changed what moon minerals were important. If you look now, the most important ones are dysprosium, promethium, neodymium, and thulium.
There used to be technetium for a while.
Well, that's it. That's what Dominion did. It changed it so that technetium and something else were the two most important ones, because it changed how much of these minerals you needed for various production, and technetium became the bottleneck. And this didn't just affect Providence, this affected all of Eve, and it was completely, utterly insane because it didn't change the fundamentals of production, it just changed which moons are important. And people have been fighting for years to get the good moons, and suddenly the good moons were rubbish, and people who'd been sitting on what were rubbish moons were suddenly sitting on a gold mine. So that was really retarded. But from a Providence point of view, we went from having very few good moons to having none. But perhaps the biggest thing of all was the SOV upgrades. One of the reasons we moved into Provi, and there were a lot of reasons for moving into Provi, but one of the reasons was it was a poor region. Providence is only good because we made it good. It's not a region you would think, oh, tons of resources will go there. And the upgrade system allowed you to upgrade your pirates and your ore and things the same way basically you can now, except it was even more extreme for a bit. And that was a disaster for us because it meant all regions were more or less the same. So there's more reason for other people to want our systems. But at the same time, it didn't benefit us because we would have to pay a lot of money to put those upgrades in. But the main people to benefit would be all the people living in our space, and there was no way for us to benefit from it except using it in a tiny way, and we would only get a very small percentage of the benefit. So it just made it all more attractive to other people instead of being a useless dump while making it no more valuable to us.
Well, I can 100% see why you'd get the impression that CCP would be gunning against Pravi if that's your perspective, because it kind of seems like that's what happened.
Oh, that is exactly what happened. It was, I mean, the patch was designed against Provi. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I think, and I have information to back that up. I'm not guessing, but it may not have been knowingly done by CCP. The actual design came from the CSM, which I didn't know at the time. But as I say, I've done some research. That's the sort of thing an organisation like the CSM is always going to do, and this was deliberate sabotage and corruption because the guy behind it was actually our biggest hater.
That would be before my time. I have no idea who that.
Well, if you're going to play this publicly, I'm not going to name names, but
No.
anybody who wants to know can work it out.
So I'm curious, what's your current impression of the Sob system now? Because I think the main
Um,
purpose of it was just to get rid of the HP grind, right?
yes, and actually, I quite like it. It's certainly a hell of a lot better than what came in with Dominion. It's hard to think of anything that could be worse than that, frankly, but um, I quite like it. I actually have a problem with the whole solve concept. I mean, what does it mean?
Would you say that the method of sovereignty acquisition is arbitrary?
I'd say the concept of solve is arbitrary.
Well, I mean, I imagine that you would want CVA to own, well, I mean, in part, own Providence. So how would you make that happen outside of the current system?
You own somewhere if you have the stations and the ships and the people there to own it. Putting up a flag saying we own it, I mean, what does that mean? It's nothing.
Well, it can mean something if you can shoot the flag.
Yeah, but the flag's not doing anything. It's just a thing there so that you can shoot it. It seems a retarded approach to me. But the thing that's fundamentally wrong with Eve, and this it predates the CSM, they've done this since the earliest days, is that they are happy to change the rules frequently and randomly in ways that make no sense. If you were playing a game like chess or Monopoly or something, and somebody suggested, let's change the rules halfway through a game, you'd think they were nuts. Um, the rules are the rules. Just changing them is a very drastic step, and it's been very, very unhealthy for the game. And any change, this is going to sound odd, benefits two types of people. It may be more or less depending on what the change is. but it always benefits the hardcore serious players over the casuals because it takes you a certain amount of time to adjust to the new rules. And if you play a couple of hours a week, 10 hours to adjust is a long time. If you play 10 hours a day, then it's not. And the other thing is it benefits the destroyers because if you are going to build, that requires a lot of very long-term planning, and destroying does not. And when you change the rules, you throw everybody's plans out the window.
So how would you? So if there's a problem with your soft system, and you would say, "Oh well, there's this bad gameplay element to it." You mentioned the issue where if they just have a bigger fleet than you, then why bother, right? Am I correct
Yeah,
about that?
yeah,
So my interpretation of that, and that's basically the same argument people make when they say n plus one, where it's
yeah,
just like if they got one more than you, then why bother?
yeah.
Um, so the the current soft system, I think it tries to some extent to alleviate that.
It
I
does.
don't know if that was in the design,
Oh,
but
it must have been.
so if yeah, if you were to implement a change like that, how would you do it? Because as you say, change it's my personal belief that some of the change has not been good, but how do you change a system like that in your own view as somebody who's obviously been through a lot of
I
early
th-
changes needed?
in things like SOV, I wouldn't change them unless they were absolutely horrible. The Dominion system was absolutely horrible, and that had to be changed. I think the fuzzy SOV system is good enough. Um, I would get rid of SOV altogether if I'd been designing the game from scratch. I mean, give you a more sort of fundamental point. I've made this to people in general. In real life, we work in base 10. Why do we work in base 10? Because we got 10 fingers. Not because it's a logical base to work in, it's not. If we actually sat down and worked it out logically, we'd work in base 12. There was an ancient civilization that tried to get us all to work in base 12, but it didn't survive after it collapsed. Base 12 is clearly logically superior. That doesn't mean I'm suggesting that we should all switch to working base 12. If we did that, we wouldn't know what our names are or where we lived, and our entire civilization would collapse. But if we'd done it that way from the start, it would have been better. But if we'd done it that way from the start is not the same as saying we should change it now. And they just don't have enough consideration for the effect that change has on the game. And what the game needs is more focus on the role play side and the activity. One of the things I still have mixed opinions about this drifter thing, and I don't know enough about what it's doing exactly to really make an informed comment. But
Don't think a lot of us do.
I do like that they introduced it without warning.
Really?
Why should aliens inform us before they invade? Yeah, I mean that just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Actually, I can't. I like the way that it was implemented personally. I made an argument on Reddit, which I got downvoted to hell for. But the argument that I made was that I like the premise of them just coming out of nowhere and just bashing stuff because it turned out well, if nothing else. And I'm not really a tactician in that
Well,
sense, so
there's
I
a
don't
couple of
know.
things that I think that are wrong with it. Firstly, there should be some way of doing something about it.
I agree with that.
Um, and secondly, I think it's just fundamentally wrong that the drifters don't drop any loot.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Um, but I got no problems with them turning up and beating the crap out of people.
Well, my argument that I used was that okay, so you want to surprise the player base, but the only issue with that is that if you're gonna basically whack on people a lot, like that is a destructive change. Now, I'm not saying that destructive changes are bad, but if you don't do it correctly, my problem is that if CCP does something like that without warning, and the result is negative, that's not good because they didn't have time to get feedback on if it was a good idea, and there was no sort of say on the player base and say, well, okay, so for example, when Fozzy was released, there was a problem that everybody was telling CCP about, but I think they missed it for some reason, where interceptors could just go around going through bubbles and just entoses everything. The problem with that is that that's a stupid idea. So CCP inevitably changed it, I think, so that interceptors can't use entosis anymore. Um, and also, they later on, this is not as related, but some interceptors are no longer nullified to bubbles. So that was my fear, because if they just do stuff like that, the consequences are probably going to be more frequent, but also harder hitting. But I agree with you that like I don't think that it's bad that they're just running around bashing stuff. I think that's awesome. But I also agree that they should drop a loot. I think it's the case that drifters drop loot required for entosising, but I don't think it's sufficient for the risk. That's just my interpretation. I haven't done it in a long
I
time.
don't say that the loot should be specific to the risk. I was under the impression that they dropped nothing, but maybe I'm wrong. I
That might
never
be the
thought
case.
that.
I remember them dropping some loot. I don't know if it was worth anything. It could have been the Circadian Sleepers, Circadian Seekers. Well, they'd be Antikytherian Lancers now. I'm pretty sure that one of the two dropped some loot that was required for Entosis modules. I'm not really. I'm from a null
I think
block.
the Lancers are drifters, aren't they?
Yes, but when you're talking about drifters, most people mean the things that can blap you very, very quickly. So my understanding, and I haven't done it in a while, is that you shoot the autothiazine lancers, I think they're called, and you shoot them enough that eventually drifters will come and own zone you. And if you try to shoot drifters, once they have two shields, once the first shield goes down, they doomsday you with I think it's 450k damage. It's something like that, and that's why people don't usually screw with them because they just kill everything. But again, I haven't shot drifters in a while.
They are famous for their doomsday, certainly.
Yeah, I think they've one shot quite a few carriers, which is pretty fun. So, I don't want to hold you for too long, but I do want to ask you about Provi and maybe CVA. So, how do you feel about Provi back then? Let's say before Dominion, because we talked a bit about that. And then I want your thoughts on what Provi is now.
Well, the first thing about Provi was, hmm,
Hard question, so for whatever you want.
I think a lot of people miss what Provi was about originally. It was CVA is an Amarian loyalist organization, and it started out just fighting Ushra Khan, or Ushra Khan's predecessors. They've actually changed name a couple of times, but in HiSec, and there were agreed wars. And I joined CVA very early on with my corporation, Imperial Dreams. And I was never particularly big on the HiSec wars, but we were an Amarian loyalist organization. And that's right. So what happened was, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that CVA did so well, because we were never putting, most of the time, we weren't putting our full power into it. What happened was Pi, who was the main force in CVA, would fight the terrorists, and most of the time they'd win. And if they started to lose, then we'd come and give them a hand until they were back on top of things. And when they were on top, we'd go back to minding our own business. And I've actually had people say to me back then, oh, ID's its own corporation. I thought it was just, the industrial arm of Pi. Anyway, we did our own thing. And it was me who talked CVA into coming down to domain, saying, let's not just focus on terrorists, let's try and get rid of some pirates. And the lower domain area was full of pirates. It was so full of pirates that there was no piracy because nobody went there because it was just suicide. And, and we fought the pirates, and we drove them out. And then we thought, well, let's grab a bit of Provi. And then there was a bit of a discussion inside Pi, and a lot of Pi didn't want to do that. So they were very nice and generous about it. They said, well, we don't really need an alliance. We're going to go back to HiSec. We'll give you CVA. And that's how I became the leader of CVA. And in fact, the leader of Pi left Pi and joined us. A fellow called Harding, great guy. And so we started moving into Provi and claiming it for the Empire. And the Ushra Khan moved in to oppose us. And pretty soon there were 3 powers in Providence. Can't remember what the third one was called. Anyway, both we and Ushra Khan approached them and said, you know, want to be on our side? And they said, no, don't want to have anything to do with you. Don't want anything on either of you. And so we were okay with that. We said, okay, you're neutral, fine.
Would you be referring to against all authority?
No.
Okay. Because I think they're kind of dead now.
They are, but and a lot of people think I must be very anti against all authorities, but actually, as human beings, they were a pretty decent bunch, and they were very civil. I'll get round to them in a bit if you've got the patience for this. Do you want me to carry on?
Go for it. The only issue I would have is to make sure that the recording is good, in the sense that like I'm not screwing up anything on my end. So
Okay.
I
Do you
think
need
we
to
should
check
be fine. No, I think I should be fine. The only worry that I have is to make sure that your audio is being included. I'm 99% sure that it is, but if it isn't, then I'm gonna have a cow. We should be good. Yeah, if you want to cover them, you can go.
Well, what happened between the 3 of us in Provi, or against all authorities, were based down in Stain. So Ushra Khan, we were about equally matched 3 ways, and this other lot were neutral to us. We didn't bother them, they didn't bother. I think they were called NOS, if I remember correctly. It's a long time ago. And then Ushra Khan attacked them. So we said, do you want to be our allies now? They said, yeah, we do.
Ushra Khan?
No, NOS, the 3rd power in Provi. And that's how we came to drive Ushra Khan out, basically. They shot themselves in the foot. And we ended up taking control of Provi, which we hadn't really set out to do. We set out to grab Lower Domain and then a little bit of Provi. But hey, grabbing Provi with the Empire, good thing. And NRDS has always followed logically from that because we're bringing Amarian civilization. You can't have symbolization without NRDS. Anything else is just banditry. So we set up our rules and created our system, and there's a lot to the system. There's a lot of things, and I think this is where some things have gone wrong in Provi now. A lot of people don't understand why we did things the way we did them. And I've stopped doing them. And that's my fault because I did things thinking I was being a bit cunning and I didn't tell people why we were doing them, and it just worked and people thought that was coincidence.
Yeah, that could be an issue sometimes. I know how that feels.
Yeah. And I give you an example that people do understand rather than revealing any secrets. We set up a channel for everybody who was in Provi called the Citadel to exchange intel.
Yeah, I remember using it.
And the idea of the Citadel was we knew there would be spies in there. Of course there are going to be spies in there. Almost anybody can join. Not absolutely anybody. You have to get past our people to get in, but it's not hard. Or it wasn't hard in those days. It's got a lot harder. And that's something I think was a bit of a mistake. But anyway, uh, so the point is that the rule in the Citadel was you only report red intel. No blue or neutrals are ever to be reported. You're not allowed to say where you are. You're only allowed to say where reds are.
I remember that. Yeah.
And the purpose of this was that we knew the place was going to be full of spies. If we're reporting reds, well, what good's that going to do reds? I mean, either they already know where they are, or they're going to find out about another group of reds. Well, they're welcome to go and beat each other up. I've got no problem with that.
Probably happened to way more than.
I'm sure it did. So that's what I mean by a design decision. And there were quite a lot of those sort of design decisions to adapt to our strengths and avoid our weaknesses. And I think the system worked reasonably well. AAA, going back to that, they were hostile pirate neighbors. And you're always going to have hostile pirate neighbors. We're the only NRDS group there is of any consequence. And a lot of people who claim to be NRDS weren't. But they played, I was going to say nicely, that's pushing it a bit too far. I'll give you an example. One of our directors had his account hacked.
Ooh.
And the person who did it took the opportunity to disband CVA, which meant all our sov fell over and all that. Now, it was a hacking. It wasn't, wasn't a traitor. It was cheating. And CCP did set it right after a few days. But in the meantime, AAA moved to protect our borders and stop other people coming in to abuse that.
Heard about that.
And so, credit to them. Absolutely. I've got a lot of respect for them over that. And then later on, when the big war blew up for two reasons, which happened at the same time, not related to one another. One was the Dominion patch you already mentioned. And it was obvious that we were going to be in a situation where there were only going to be a few megapowers. And so we had to try and be a megapower, and we failed. And that meant invading Catch. It's the only region that borders on Provi. It's the only possible way to go. And that meant attacking AAA. And they tried very hard to negotiate with us and make a peace agreement and not to stumble over us. But I didn't want to play that way. If we had to survive on their mercy, then that wasn't going to do us any good.
Yeah. I remember that happening in Provi when I left. A lot of the time, I think Provi was making background deals to survive. I don't know how true that is.
Well, in the recent invasion with Pandemic Legion, Provi made deals with Test to survive, but that was a perfectly sensible deal. It wasn't, I mean, Test are, in a way, they're a lot like AAA. They come in and harass us and all that, but they're not fundamentally unfriendly, and they do help us sometimes on bigger issues. But you also have to remember it's in their advantage to do so.
Right.
They look things through to the longer term. And when Pandemic Legion had invaded Provi, we made a deal with Test. I say we, I wasn't involved in this anyway. whereby Test invaded, beat up Pandemic Legion with our help, and then they got to take the stations, which was the whole reason Pandemic Legion invaded in the first place. And because CCP had cleverly set up this system where basically somebody was going to have to invade Provi because of the way the change from stations to citadels went.
Oh yeah, that
So
was gonna.
yeah, that was going to happen. And that's another example of them screwing us over. And again, I know that they knew that was going to happen before. So when they made that decision. So CCP don't love us, that's for sure. But that was to Test's benefit. They got to beat up on PL, they got our stations. But in return, we got our space back. And Test themselves and most of their allies behaved pretty respectably, and there's certainly a couple who didn't. But mostly they were pretty good.
Oh, I'm like allied with Test. They're
I
blue
know.
to me.
And you were one of those alliances, and your lot behaved just fine.
Well, I appreciate that. I actually see Test get a lot of crap. I had a weird interaction with a guy who said that because I was a nullsec, all I did was mining and fleet PvP, and my kill board's like almost entirely solo. So like, there's some weird people being thrown in with the pack there. That was the weirdest interaction I've ever had with anyone on Reddit. Um, but it happened. I still can't get over the fact that that was so weird. Um, but my experience has been that people from my coalition are generally good people. I went to Eve North with my corp. That was awesome. And we met all sorts of people from my coalition who were really, really nice to us and are genuinely good people. It's not all that often that you find truly bad people playing Eve.
I have met in gaming experience some astonishingly bad people, but mostly they're not too bad. Even the enemies. I mean, most historically our biggest enemies have been Ushra Khan, and as far as I can tell, they're a great band of people. I've got respect for them. If I wasn't in CVA, I'd have been in Ushra Khan, you know. But if you look at some of the complete shitholes have been people like what are they called now? Social Hand Guiding Club, Guiding Hand Social Club. There we go. Well, all they did was infiltrate people, and they would spend 6 months infiltrating people, getting to know them, getting in a position of power, rob them, leave. Now, that was their entire existence.
It's crazy. I've never heard of
And sometimes people would think, "Oh, that's cool. I want to join the Guarding Hand Social Club," and you had to pay lots and lots of money. And then they let you in, and you joined, and then they killed you and threw you out.
that. Wow.
You couldn't join. It was just, mind you, anybody want to join that bunch of scumbags. This is what they got. But yeah, they existed solely to be unpleasant to people on a personal level rather than just blowing up people's ships. It's really foul.
So I'm curious, what do you think of the current Provi? Because I have had my negative experiences with Provi. I was part of a mostly Care Bear alliance, to be fair, but and they left Provi. I wasn't really around for most of it, but they have had their misgivings with Provi, and I know I have had mine. I don't know how much they are in sync, but I I very much find that when I end up relying on NRDS for something to happen, like when I'm mentoring a new player or whatever it was, I don't do it anymore because they all end up dying. They all end up dying. So I'm curious to know what your take is on Pravi now, and how you feel that it might be going future. And I'd also like to know what you think of Eve in general after that, like as it is today.
I think CCP have missed too many fundamental points, and I think the game is gradually sliding downhill. I don't think the recent changes have been bad. I think citadels are an improvement on stations. They solved a lot of what was wrong with stations. The way they handled the changeover from stations to citadels was appalling, but the stage citadels themselves are a good thing. Um, but they have just missed the really core issues, and that will grind the game down. As far as Provi is concerned, that's very difficult for me to answer fairly. I was saying earlier, we've all got our prejudices. Self-evidently, it's not done the way I would have done it. The only person who was ever going to do things the way I would do them is me. Everybody's going to have their own slight handle on it. I think it's absolutely fantastic that Equi has managed to keep it going all these years. Um, and he's now been CVA leader for longer than I was, and I was doing it for a long time. Um, so I'm very impressed with his tenacity and determination for the cause, and a lot of other people too. There's a lot of people really fighting to keep things going. There have also been a lot of people who are not like that, um, and I think CVA have dropped a few core elements of the way I designed it that have led to it not working quite as well as it used to. But that again is just my opinion, and I'm probably rather biased. Um, Overall, I've got to say they do a good job.
So I'm curious, what are the things that you would have done that current CVA isn't doing?
I don't want to,
Okay.
that's asking too much. Any people are already going to feel got at by what I've said already, and that wasn't very much. Um, I mean, it's just a simple. Obviously, I'm going to have differences, and I've got far more in common. I'm still a thorough supporter of CVA. The fact that I'm not a member is straighten that up. I came back to the game and joined my old corporation, Imperial Dreams, and that has the same goals and is honestly and nobly done and is struggling for the Empire and Providence, and it's great. But the administration and leadership of the court was not done in a way that I felt at all comfortable with. This wasn't a moral thing, it was a practical thing, and it ended in me leaving. And I wish them all the best in the world. I hope they can make it work. Uh, Sorry?
Go.
But that means that I'm not in CVA. It doesn't mean that I have anything against CVA. I've had lots of red groups try and recruit us. But no, I'm still very much a supporter of CVA.
Well, you say that it might bother people, but my observation was that you split off from Pi Inc. And I've talked to some people from Pi Inc. recently. Uh, they seem perfectly fine with their arrangement. They're killing stuff in Losag a lot, and it seems like you
Well,
have a
they were
similar thing
fine with
going
it.
on.
Who left who? I mean, technically they left us. We were in CVA, and Pi could have just said, no, CVA is going back to Empire because they were running CVA. But they didn't. They said, okay, ID, you can have CVA. We're going back to Empire. And it was a very friendly parting, and we've helped one another repeatedly since. And, it couldn't have been done better. Um, who split off from who? Who cares? It
It
was,
seems like regardless, it's like your similar situation where you know things just split off, and it's more tactical than
yeah, yeah, there are similarities. Yeah.
So I'm curious, is there anything that you missed while you were gone that you wish you
All the skill points.
had? Yeah, yeah, I know
Um,
that.
One of the reasons I came back, and it was not the only reason by any means, but one of the reasons was that I heard that CVA was in a lot of trouble because of the pandemic Legion invasion, because of the change to station stroke citadels. And I came back to help. Um, and I think I did help. Not hugely, but did my best.
That was actually my final question. Yeah, what overall you think brought you back to Eve?
Well, a combination of that, and during my absence, I'd been playing another game. And in there, that game made very similar mistakes to Eve. It was in many ways a really great game. It's a swords and sorcery sandbox game called Mortal. And in many ways, it's fantastic. But it had done the same thing that Eve had done and listened to its players. And it had one very loud and very obnoxious group who were extremely unpleasant people. And we'd been fighting them for years, and they'd repeatedly got the rules changed in ways that benefited them. And I just had enough.
Yeah, when
Uh,
I joined after the whole Band of Brothers versus Goonswarm thing, and I've only heard things about it. In retrospect, do you think that's much different from what you've got going on here with Provi versus PL? Obviously, like the scope is different. PL is much bigger, and it was very clearly just a wash through Provi. But do you think that like it was a
PL
healthier?
didn't walk through Provi. It took them a long time to take it out, and
Well, it's a
Provi put up a heroic resistance. It wasn't just a lot of citadels. PL lost a lot of ships. Um, but
good.
sure, Provi was losing, and it was going to lose. But Tess stomped all over them with our help. I mean, you know, we certainly weren't enough to take out PL, nor close to doing so. But we were a big enough power to make a significant difference when Test were fighting them. Yeah, it meant the Test were fighting on friendly ground. Put it that way.
Well, Provi seems it seems like both sides won because it seems like Provi's goal has always been to just maintain what Provi is, not necessarily just win all the time. I mean,
Yes,
Provi's job is basically to be Provi. It is not just to dominate everything.
that's right.
And in that way, regardless of what I think of CVA, they've succeeded in giant ways because Pravi is, I'm pretty sure, the oldest block around. It doesn't look like it's going
It
anywhere.
is. Um, it was consciously built to last, and just built Provi. I always used to say, build up, not out. And we did turn Provi into a hugely rich and powerful region, and then Dominion kicked us in the arse.
That's interesting because I've never heard of a Pravi that's like a very large power block that has influence like PL or Goons or what have you.
It didn't have influence because nobody was scared of us because they knew we weren't coming out of Provi to hassle them or
Well,
anything, but the
yeah,
power was there.
yeah, a significant amount.
Um, and when, after there's a lot more I could say about this, but the short version came to when AAA invaded back into Provi after we invaded them. I can't stress enough that we started it, but well, we started it partly because of Dominion. I didn't mention the other thing. The other reason was that AAA had given bases to Ushra Khan in their territory. So they clearly aligned themselves with Ushra Khan. So that was war. Um, but there was a huge battle in the D-G system, which both sides knew was coming over Sov, and it was going to be a make or break. And I was pretty sure we were going to lose this battle, but I was okay with that. We didn't need to win. And this is one of the ways Provi has always done things. If you come here and you give us a hard time, we are going to make you bleed. And if we bleed more, that's okay. And if you come here and bleed, sooner or later somebody else is going to kick you around the back of the head because you've weakened yourself. And this has been where a lot of powers have come to die. If you look at PL's modern problems, they start with the invasion of Provi. And this has happened repeatedly. Pirate alliances who invade Provi end up regretting it.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Well, I mean, many.
Yeah, so I was okay with losing the battle as long as they bled, and then we could field the ships again. And so we'd got a fleet of about 800, which was pretty much exactly what the enemy had. And over 100 capitals, which in those days was a lot.
And not so much anymore.
Not so much anymore, but in those days that was massive. At the time, it was the biggest battle a game had ever seen.
Wow.
And the the thing was that caused massive lag, as you'd expect. And CCP changed the rules of the game mid-battle. And that resulted in our ships jumping in, never loading the system, being blown up, and not being able to log out. People crashed the game and were being killed 4 hours later.
I heard about that.
And so we were wiped out without being able to fire a shot. Normally, if they hadn't changed the rules mid-battle, this would have crashed the system. Then everybody would have scrambled to log back in, and it would have been more or less even terms. But we were wiped out without a shot. One of the funny things is that Atlas came in to assist AAA. They jumped into a different part of the system, warped to where we had jumped into, and were sitting there for hours shooting us as we arrived in system, even though we jumped in first.
That's true.
Anyway,
Is tie-dye after your?
yes, it is.
What do you think of?
I think it's stupid, but they had to have some solution. They created this problem by making these alliances bigger. One of the problems with CCP is they're often not looking for what's best for the game. They're looking for what will make the big headlines. They want to make the biggest battles ever.
I can see
And big
that. Yeah,
battles are actually not a lot of fun.
I see that too.
Um,
For new players, it's a lot of fun, but after you know, it gets old after.
it gets old because, well, for one thing, everything's going in slow motion, whether it's organized tie-dye style or just plain lag. And for another thing, there isn't much room for personal skill. Most people are just F1 monkeys following their orders. Small fleet battles are far more entertaining. And CCP have made this happen with, I mean, it's the natural trend of things for alliances to get bigger and bigger, but they have accelerated the process massively through a lot of very bad game design decisions.
Sounds like Provi was a lot smaller back then, by the looks of what you're
No, it's a lot bigger.
like numeric.
Mm, massively bigger.
Well, I imagine right now there's about 400 people in the set. Something.
Uh-huh. I don't know if you're right. Be surprised if it's that many. If it was, let me see.
So I remember back in the day. I think this is about 2014, 2015, when that number. I think it would go up to 1,000. I could be wrong about.
No, no, it got well over 1,000 before Dominion.
That.
Yeah,
Well, thanks for telling me all this stuff, dude. I very much appreciate
that's okay. So, back to my original question, what's really the point of all this? I mean, you're planning to play this back to people? I mean, is it for your alliance? You run some news organization? What are you up to?
it. No, I just know that, like, I've got a lot of people that I know who came from Provi and that were there for a real long time. Like my old
Well,
CEO.
Back in pre-Dominion days, I know that Provi had as much population as the next most populated 20 null-sex regions.
Provi, way back, like 2014, I think it was actually 2015, they were releasing statistics on what was built and lost, and Provi was still up there, especially lost. But there was a lot of stuff built in Provi. Obviously, it was knocked down by stuff like the Forge, for example. But like Provi was still pretty big. I don't know if it recovered after Dominion, because I don't know how low it sank during Dominion, but it was still pretty
Well,
big.
Dominion meant we completely lost Provi. Took us a year and a half to get it back.
Well, true, but you don't really ever lose Provi.
We did completely.
You got it back.
Yeah.
You spent like I imagine a very long time getting it back, and the numbers are still
Yeah.
there.
A
Well,
year and a
some of
half. Some
them.
of them.
Sorry, they gave them,
No, we got them back. Got Provi back. We fought.
but like after Dominion happened and you fought Provi back, you still had quite a few people. It probably wasn't as much as it was, but it was more than
It was a
nothing
minute fraction. Mm.
really. That's the
I
you
mean, when
know,
Provi fell, most people ran off to other sections of the universe. They thought, yeah, that's it, Provi's dead, blah, move on. I mean, it was very much a hardcore who stayed on to fight. And then once you get Provi back, you start building up again.
well, I know that Provi, like when I was back in Provi, I was never really given the impression that it was outright anemic. I had the impression of Pravi that, of course, other blocks were bigger, but Pravi could hold its own against the fights that had been picked against it or it had picked. I didn't really get the impression that it was a shadow of its former self. I heard that about Test, but I didn't hear that about
Well,
Pravi.
you're talking about 2015, right?
2014, 2015, probably also a little bit of early 2013 as well.
Well, there's a lot of recovery gone on by then. We probably had been recovered a couple of years before that. And even so, it has never reached the heights it was at before Dominion.
That's crazy. Yeah, one of the I always regret not joining Eve earlier, and that's one of the things that I feel like I would have benefited from, is seeing a project like that, because it eventually it became apparent to me that if Goons or PL came knocking on the door of Pravi, we knew what was going to happen. It might be a lot of fun, and a lot of supers might be getting killed, but yeah, a dedicated campaign was going to knock Pravi down every time.
Hmm.
That
Oh
was
yeah,
my interpretation.
yeah, we've always known it. But if, for example, something like Goons invade Provi, Provi's going to lose. We know that. But Goons would probably lose too.
You mean like to PL?
I mean, they'd have to put so much effort into Provi that they'd have their backs turned to everybody else. Um, and other people would take the opportunity.
Tell you this much: Pravi is a damn good distraction.
Yeah. And people think, oh, a part of it's the obsession with Solve and stations and things. People think, oh, we can go and we can crush Provi, we destroy all those stations in a month, and that'll be the end of that. No.
Yeah,
So
no.
we haven't got any Solve, so we haven't got any stations. We're still here. We're still fighting.
Well,
You're
I
still
mean,
going to have a lot of people tied down if you think you're going to hold it.
that's because Pravi doesn't like. You said that you like, if you're gonna make, if they make you bleed, you're gonna make them bleed too, and you might bleed more, but it'll still be worth it. Well, my take on it was that Pravi bleeds an entirely different blood. It's not about the ISK for you guys, and it wasn't about the ISK for me. I didn't care about ISK. It's, you've built a structure, and that structure isn't really important to what Pravi is, because if there wasn't a structure, then you'd just be a block, like some block in nullsec, right? It's very different,
Yeah. Yes. It is.
and a lot of people really appreciate that about. I certainly.
Thank you.
Anyway,
Probably is. It's different, and I think all of us involved with it are proud of it.
absolutely. Like, I I still kind of miss Provi, but like my guys are here now, and so I'm
Sure.
not going to leave.
A hell
But
of a lot of people out there are ex-Provi, in every faction.
probably a lot of PL.
Probably.
Anyway, I'm going to cut the recording.
Okay.